And this is just your little reminder before we start today about our four-source hypothesis. That is that Matthew and Luke had a copy of Mark, which they've reproduced to a large extent in their gospel. That's the purple. They also shared a source that has been dubbed the name Quell from the German word for source, which is Quell. So it's known as Q. And the green material is material found only in Matthew, and the kind of turquoise colour is material found only in Luke. And this is the relationships between the synoptic gospels. Again, just a reminder, where we have Mark, and unique to Mark, we have a small percentage there unique to Mark. And then we have a small percentage unique to or found in Mark and Luke, and another small percentage found in Mark and Matthew. The rest of that percentage, that 76%, is known as the triple tradition because Luke and Matthew use that material from Mark somewhere in their Gospels, 41% in Luke and 45% in Mark. And the double tradition or Q tradition, you can see that 23% in Luke and 25% in Matthew. And then 20% of Matthew's gospel is unique to Matthew, and 35% of Luke's gospel is unique to Luke. That's just a reminder as we come into today. And these are the things we've said so far about the gospels. Mark is about discipleship, following Jesus, authority, has a sense of immediacy and a servant leadership. In Matthew, we have Jesus as Messiah, fulfilling Old Testament prophecy. Jesus is presented as the second Moses, and there is an emphasis on the law. And today we come to Luke, and Luke is commonly known as the gospel of inclusivity, of gracious invitation, universalism, hospitality, justice. And Luke tells us that he uses sources, so we don't know all the time, apart from Mark and Q, what they might be. And John is yet to come, and you can see there's some things set out for John, but we will move to Luke, or almost to Luke. So just to recap, Luke has 41% of the triple tradition, that it's found in the three synoptics. He has 23% of the double tradition, that's found in Matthew and Luke, and only 1% in Mark and Luke, but not in Matthew, and 35% of Luke's gospel is just unique to his gospel. So we're going to have a little discussion now about the stories that are found only in Luke's gospel. So what stories about Jesus are only found in Luke's gospel, and what parables of Jesus are only told in Luke's gospel. And I'm going to pop you into breakout rooms for about 6 minutes. Welcome back from your groups, everyone. You can see that I've moved to being in a Roman marketplace in honour of being looking at the Gospel of Acts today. What stories are unique to the Gospel of you that you discovered in your groups?
Lots.
Lots of them. Well, that's not quite an answer. Would you like to unpack the lots?
The narrative. The birth narrative.
The birth narrative, yes. That's a very easy one.
Acts.
Well, Acts, yes, but we're talking about the gospel at the moment.
Okay.
Acts is not
birth story. The birth stories is that Luke gives is peculiar to Luke, but Matthew also has a birth story.
Well, it's not actually a birth story. It's a sort of post-birth story.
Boyhood.
Yeah.
It's not boyhood, but yes, in Luke we have a boyhood, don't we?
Yeah, we have boyhood. Yeah,
we do. Where at 12 he defects to the temple instead of going home with his parents.
Yep.
We've also got the visit of Mary to Elizabeth and the babies recognising each other in their mother's womb.
Yep. That's unique to Luke.
The genealogy, even though it's not like tracing back the ancestry, it's not unique to Luke, but Luke goes right back to Son of God. He goes right back to Adam and then Son of God.
Yes, it does go back to Adam.
But is it one a maternal line and one a paternal line?
What was that again, Bill?
Is one a maternal line and the other a paternal line? They're different in that way?
No,
they're different.
They're different, but they've got different names, and Matthew constructs his differently and only goes back to Abraham.
Yeah.
So they've both got genealogies, but they've got different motives. Matthew's Jewish gospel goes back to the father of the Jews, the patriarch Abraham. Luke's much more inclusive universalist gospel goes back to the beginning of humanity, which is Adam. So their genealogies actually reflect their themes.
Okay. I think he also includes the women who were not Jewish, doesn't he? Does Matthew do that as well?
No, Matthew doesn't like non-Jewish people particularly. He has one woman, that's the Canaanite one.
Yeah.
Yeah. What else do we have in the Gospel of Luke that's unique?
Zacchaeus.
What was that, Norman?
Zacchaeus.
Zacchaeus, yes.
Yeah.
The Good Samaritan.
Well, we're not up to parables, but yes, you were right, Derek. The Good Samaritan is unique.
We're not looking at parables? No.
We're still looking at stories about Jesus that are unique to the
Oh.
Gospel of Luke.
Right. Is the ascension?
Jesus is rejected in Nazareth.
What was that, John?
Jesus is rejected in Nazareth.
He's rejected in Nazareth in all of them, but Luke's is quite distinctive. So you're on the right track there. He is rejected in Nazareth, but it's because he makes the crowd very angry with what he says, which is unique to the Gospel of Luke. So, yes.
The lady who washed his feet with her tears.
Yes, that is in other Gospels, but it is told slightly differently in Luke.
The visit to Martha and Mary.
Yes, Martha and Mary, that episode of them and Mary sits at his feet is unique to Luke.
Luke actually dedicates his work to Theophilus,
Yes.
which is unique in the sense that the others aren't specifically addressed to anybody.
Yes, so it seems that Luke might have a patron, Theophilus, that he's dedicating his work to or addressing it to. Anything else?
The choosing of the 72.
Yes.
Yes, the 72.
Oh,
The others
70.
only ever sent out 12, don't they?
That's right. So Luke's a bit different there. He's got a second mission with a lot more people. What
In Luke's gospel, not only is Jesus sent to trial before Pilate, but Pilate sends him on to Herod.
Herod, yes.
Yes. Yeah.
And when Luke's calling Luke's Jesus is calling the disciples, there's a specific miracle there. We remember what that is that's unique to Luke? We have the miraculous catch of fish of Peter falling to his knees.
Yeah.
Saying, go away.
Yeah. Go away. I'm a sinner. Yeah. Yep.
Go away, I am a sinner. In other words, you're obviously a holy man working miracles, and that means you've brought the eye of God with you, and I'm a sinner, and I don't really need the eye of God on me today. Thank you very much. So you and it can just take it away.
Their healing of lepers.
Yes, we have the 10 lepers, and one is the Samaritan in the Gospel of Luke.
There's an argument about
The narrow door.
Sorry,
who
what
is
was that, John?
who is the greatest of us all? Is Luke only?
What about the parables? Someone's mentioned, Derek has already mentioned the Good Samaritan. Is there any other parables unique to Luke that we?
The prodigal son.
About Lazarus and the rich man.
Lazarus and the rich man and the prodigal son. Yes, well spotted. Both unique to the Gospel of Luke.
The lost coin.
True measure.
The lost son.
The lost son.
Food manager.
And there's 2 healing miracles that are in Luke concerning women.
The
Persistent widow.
has the demon.
We have a persistent widow. Yes. Sorry, Jane, what was that?
The touching of the gown.
Touching of the gown, that does occur in other Gospels, though Luke seems to tell it a little bit differently.
Lazarus and the rich man.
Yes, we've mentioned that. And we've also got one of a woman in a synagogue. Who remembers that? That's the bent over woman who couldn't stand still.
Who's bowed down. Yes, he heals her.
Yes, he does heal her. John, do you want to fill any more gaps there?
No, I think we've done well.
I think we have done well.
The story of building the tower and planning to go to war in chapter 13, and where Jesus calls people to repent, that's only told in Luke's gospel.
And it's a very weird story.
Yeah, but it's got hellfire and brimstone, so, you know, good stuff.
Probably the only place that doesn't hellfire and brimstone in the Gospel of Luke. He's not as fond. And how does the Gospel of Luke end? Someone said the ascension, but for the ascension, there's a really important narrative that we also like it a lot. That's unique.
The disciples are to remain in Jerusalem.
Yes, they are. But what's happening first? We've got this thing that we've named after it, where we go away for a weekend and
Emmaus.
Road to Emmaus.
Emmaus Road.
Oh, Emmaus. Yeah.
That's it, Emmaus Road, which is unique to the Gospel of Luke, and we like that too.
Now, Luke's famous for two roads. One is the Emmaus Road, and the other, as we'll see in Acts, is the Damascus Road. Paul on the road to Damascus. Yes.
Okay, I think you've done well in finding that Luke's unique material. So John will take it from here and talk to you more about Luke.
So I want to say some things about the structure of Luke and then add on to that the structure of Acts. Now, we've already noted that the first 4 verses, the preface to the work, is distinctive to Luke. Then we've also talked about the birth narrative, the conception and birth, and Elizabeth meeting up with Mary, etc. So all of those first 2 chapters is quite distinctive to Luke. But the interesting thing is that he starts the story in Judea. He starts with the parents of the child who we will know as John the Baptist. And the father of John is a priest who takes his turn in the temple. So the work begins geographically in Judea. From the time Jesus is an adult, he's baptized, he's tempted, he begins his preaching and healing mission. That's set in Galilee, as it was in Mark and also in Matthew. So chapter 3 to chapter 9 of Luke's Gospel is a familiar collection of basically triple tradition material set in Galilee. There's a very distinctive verse in chapter 9, verse 51, where Luke says Jesus set his face to go to Jerusalem. Now, he doesn't actually get to Jerusalem until chapter 19, but from the end of chapter 9 through to the middle of chapter 19, Jesus is on the way. He's on the road with his disciples and followers heading towards Jerusalem. And in that journey section, as it's often called, there's quite a lot of the special Luke material. A lot of the stuff that we're talking about is distinctive to Luke. And then he arrives in Jerusalem, and from chapter 20 to chapter 24, the passion narrative of Jesus is told. And yes, as was noted, right at the end, the disciples are not told in Luke's Gospel like they were in Mark and Matthew to go to Galilee. They're told to stay in Jerusalem. But that structure, I want to suggest, is symbolic. Beginning in Judea, Jesus' adult ministry in Galilee, a long journey towards Jerusalem, and then the end of his earthly time in Jerusalem. And that's the map alongside, just so you can orient yourself. So you can see down the bottom Jerusalem, which is where he ends up, Jericho, which of course is on the way to Jerusalem, and up the top in Galilee, Nazareth, Cana, Capernaum, and a whole lot of other places. And in the middle, of course, is the territory of Samaria. Samaritans become important as well in Luke's story. But I want to suggest that not only has Luke shaped his gospel with some intention, but also the book of Acts has quite some intentionality. The ascension of Jesus is the climax to the gospel, where the disciples are told to stay in Jerusalem, and Jesus leaves them and ascends into heaven. But the ascension to Jesus, after another little prologue at the beginning of Acts, the ascension is the opening scene in Acts, from Acts 1, 6 till 11. And it's in that Jesus gives a theologically and geographically significant statement. You will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you. You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in all Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. So this Jesus is set apart from the Matthean Jesus that we saw last week that said, don't ever go to the Samaritans, because this Jesus says, you will be my witnesses in Samaria now that I have left. So you will receive power when the Holy Spirit have come upon you is narrated in chapter 2, the famous story of the day of Pentecost, another Lucan distinctive. You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. I want to suggest to you that the geography there sets out what happens in the book of Acts. So the second volume after the preface, the book of Acts, begins in Jerusalem and spreads through Judea, chapters 1 to 8. Then there is a section that I like to call the turn to the Gentiles. It's largely in Samaria and Antioch. Samaria is significant because apart from the Samaritan woman in John's Gospel, Luke provides us with the most material about how the gospel spread amongst the Samaritans. So that's narrated in chapter 8. Of course, in this section also, Paul is called, Saul as he is then known, is called to follow Jesus. And Peter receives a vision which turns their understanding upside down. Antioch is significant because in Antioch, that's where the followers of the way were first called Christianoi, that is, followers of the Christ, the Messiah, from which we get Christians. The story comes back to Jerusalem in chapter 12, but then, so we've been in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria, and now we head towards the ends of the earth. Paul and Barnabas are commissioned in chapter 13, and we get the activity that Paul undertakes in company with a number of different co-workers throughout chapters 13 to 21. And then the last section of Acts is Paul heading to Rome. He's actually arrested and tried and taken to Rome as a prisoner. So the geography, I think, is really interesting. Here's this story of this Jewish man, Jesus, and his Jewish followers, the disciples, the women, and it's set in Jewish territory in Judea, in Galilee, and then towards Jerusalem. Jerusalem, of course, is the capital of Israel, the capital of the Jewish people. That's where the temple is. That's where a lot of significant things happen. Acts then takes us on another geographical journey from Jerusalem across Samaria, across Judea, across Samaria, back to Jerusalem, but then out into the wider Hellenistic world. And the top left map takes, plots all of Paul's journeys, which takes him around what is called Asia Minor, which is modern day Turkey, and Macedonia and Achaia, which of course is modern day Greece. And then further across, he will go into Italy to Rome. So he ends in Rome. And just as Jerusalem ends the first volume, the Gospel, Jerusalem is the capital of the Jews. So the story in Acts ends in Rome, which is the capital of the dominant world empire, at least in that region of the day, the Roman Empire. So I think that there is quite some significant symbolism in the story that Luke tells. This is a story about a Jewish man and his Jewish followers who recruit and equip others who then go out across the Roman Empire, the Hellenistic world ruled by the Romans. And the story ends in the capital, not the Jewish capital, but the Roman capital. So that's the structure that you have set out on page 93 of your book. And that to me indicates that Luke is working as quite a creative artist. He's very thoughtful, he's very intentional in the way he shapes the story. And indeed, he tells us that. He says many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us. He says that these reports have been handed on to us by those who were from the beginning eyewitnesses and servants of the word. So in a sense, Luke is here validating what we've been doing with source criticism, and that is looking at how at least Matthew and Luke have been using sources. He actually acknowledges that there's previous material set down, which seems to indicate written material. and he wants to validate that material as having come from eyewitnesses and servants of the word, or ministers of the word. So he says, I too decided, after investigating everything carefully from the very first, so he didn't just accept everything and say, all right, that's good, I've got material, let's put it all together. He investigated. He was critically analysing the material that he had. He decided to write what he calls an orderly account. Many have undertaken to set down an orderly account. I now write an orderly account. And then he does what was quite the common practice of good written work of the time, acknowledge the patron, the person who has enabled this research to happen and this writing to happen. I wrote an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus. Theophilus, of course, a combination of two Greek words meaning God lover, lover of God. Whether Theophilus was a real person or whether the name is symbolic of all those people who want to love God and want to know about God through the story of Jesus and his followers, we don't know. I write, he says, he tells us the purpose of his work, so that you may know the truth concerning the things about which you have been instructed. In other words, he's writing to someone who already knows something of this story. This isn't the first encounter they've had with the story of Jesus, or indeed the story of the early church. They've already been instructed. But he wants to know, and the Greek word that's used here, which the NRSV translates as the truth, so that you may know, 10, asphaleon. The Greek word is asphaleon, from which we get asphalt, which of course is the bedrock, the foundation for the roads that we travel on. So it's been suggested that maybe another way to translate that is that you may know the certainty, you may be assured about the things about which you've been instructed. So Luke's first 4 verses are really interesting because he alone amongst the evangelists explains a little bit about his method and his intention in what he is saying. And that word, it's one word in Greek, that word orderly account is a word we know in English. It's T-A-X-I-S, which we would say taxis, but in Greek it was taxis. And that's a rhetorical term that means something that has a beautiful structure, something that has an intentional structure. So Luke is actually showing his education and indicating that he is working in the manner of an educated writer of the time. I just want to pause at this point if there's any questions anyone or comments anyone wants to make before we plunge into looking at one way in which Luke has worked to create his orderly account. And that'll be the material on pages 94 and 95.
John, I don't quite understand in what way the structure is symbolic. Symbolic of what?
A movement from a Jewish story, to a story for the wider Roman Hellenistic world. Sorry, I didn't make that clear enough. So whilst the first volume is about Galilee, Samaria and Judea, the second volume is about moving from Jerusalem through Samaria to the ends of the earth. Well, it doesn't really, we don't really get to the ends of the earth. We get to Rome, which is the capital, which stretches to the ends of the earth, if you like.
Is that symbolism?
Well, it is, because the geography is indicating the theology. So the geography from Jewishness to Hellenistic wide world indicates that it started with Jesus the Jew, but it's now moving out to the Gentile churches. So yes, it is.
Thank you.
Bruce.
I might be wrong, but I'm just a little curious as to the naming of the first 2 Gospels of Matthew and Mark. While they may not have been written by Matthew and Mark, I presume they were written by people who knew both of those people and therefore were passing on firsthand the teachings of those people, whereas Luke, he seems to be a clean skin, and I'm not. Where does he come from?
Well, if you read the links to the blogs that I sent in the last email, I have some discussion about what is said in the Gospels by each of the authors, and what is said about the Gospels later on in tradition. So certainly one of the things that was happening fairly early on, from the 2nd into the 3rd and 4th centuries, was that works were attached to the names of individuals, whether they were the actual authors or whether this was a kind of validating process. Yeah. But Luke certainly makes it clear, I think, that he wasn't there for the events about Jesus. There's debate about some of the events in Acts where he talks about we did this, we did that.
Yes, right. Luke, or the writer, appears when Paul gets to Troas, but when he gets back to Jerusalem, things like the birth stories might not have been written down. He may have interviewed Mary. I mean, right. She was probably still around. I mean, these were intimate details that probably hadn't been committed to paper, but they were probably oral.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think also oral tradition was very strong, stronger than in our society where written is valued. Yeah, so yeah.
So we do have to keep in mind, Derek, that the only place this stuff appears is in Luke.
Well, that's what I say. He said
tradition, it's not widely known. It is actually not known beyond this author, because we don't find it in any other writings. So we need to bear that in mind, and how much Luke's literary and theological shaping of material he has influences how he tells the story.
But he states he's made a careful study, and he's talked to eyewitnesses and so on. And while he was in Jerusalem for what, 2 or 3 years, while Paul was he had plenty of time to actually talk to these people. I mean, because he was an outsider, because he's not a Jerusalem Jew, he would need to pick up the stuff from people around who had been there.
Possibly, Derek, but nothing. I'm just pointing out, you can't say this is a definitive thing. We don't know, and we don't know that Luke wasn't a Jew. He probably was, but a very urbanized one.
Yes, but not from Jerusalem.
Well, you don't know.
Well, we pick him up in Troy. So what's he doing up in Troy?
Traveling. Who knows?
Well, yeah, I mean, the problem is we have limited information, and we need to hypothesize and extrapolate from what we have. I think we'll move on to have a look on pages 94 and 95. This is another exercise in redaction criticism. That is to say, looking at a story in Mark and then seeing how Luke reports what looks to be the same story, but he gives many more details. And there's a series of questions that you might like to work your way through in your groups on page 95.
Aware here, of course, Luke's using 2 sources, not just Mark. He's using something from the prophet Isaiah. So how much time would you like me to put people into rooms for, John?
What about 25 minutes?
Okay. So you've all come back and you've all discovered things about what Luke's done to Mark and Isaiah, yes?
Yes.
What else?
Can we ask a question? We got stuck on fulfill.
Yay.
And we could only find out another fulfill. And then we thought, if we know the Greek, we could explain it. But of course, none of us knew the Greek. So we're waiting for the oracles to explain the fulfill.
What Greek word is it?
So this is when he says, today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing. Is that what you're referring to?
Yes.
I shall refer this to John the Oracle.
Thank you.
He's got the Greek New Testament down near his desk, I know.
And then we were looking at the others and we couldn't find fulfill in it. So, yeah.
Okay. Have you your Greek there, oh great oracle?
Well, the word is pleroo, And it looks
Thank you.
like from the concordance, it appears about a dozen times in Luke's gospel and then about 20 times in Acts. The first place that or a version of it appears in Luke is about the things that have been fulfilled among us, that he writes in his orderly account. But fulfill, it literally means to come to fruition, to come to a kind of an overflowing abundance.
Okay. Right.
And so it's used of fulfilling scripture, but it's also used of the time being fulfilled as, you know, a significant moment. Is that helpful?
Yeah.
So that
Yeah.
doesn't fit in with Acts 2 though, does it? 21, is it? Where is it? And everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved.
Yeah, well, Matthew has a bit to say about that, but that's another story.
Sorry, what's the question about that?
Oh, we were just referred to other
Oh, I see.
writings, sorry. And one of them was Acts 2:21. And then we thought, oh, well, we'll ask John.
Yeah, well, that's the story of Pentecost, and Pentecost is seen as a fulfillment of, in that case, of Jesus' word that you will receive power.
Yeah. It's also a fulfillment of prophecy because it talks about the prophet Joel.
Yeah, it quotes Joel. Yeah. No.
Okay.
So when things come through, to put it at its most basic level, that have been predicted by a prophet or by Jesus or by someone.
Yeah.
So coming back to your task at hand, how has Luke changed the Gospel of Mark? Who wants to go first?
Well, he's been a bit more fulsome in his explanation, such as verses, I suppose it would be somewhere about 19 to 20, which Mark doesn't tell you what he actually got up and read.
No, he doesn't. So Luke is using another source, as I said. In this case, it's a quote from the book of Isaiah.
We don't even know that Jesus actually read anything in Mark, do we? We just know that he preached.
That's right. That's right. He just got up and preached, and obviously he did a good job because people are astounded at him initially. But in Luke spells out what he preached. Who looked up Isaiah 58? And
I did.
What did you find?
It didn't seem appropriate. Didn't seem to change anything.
Didn't change anything.
Well, I didn't
It
think.
described what the prisoners, what was being done to the prisoners, but they were still prisoners.
But left out the vengeance of the Lord.
Yes, thank you, Jen. So there's a remarkably big change, Derek. I think that was you speaking.
Oh yes, no, but that was.
We did talk about that. Derek did mention that.
Yeah, Luke has deliberately left those verses off that quote. Why do you think he would do that?
It wasn't into vengeance.
Good news. He doesn't want you to learn the bad news.
That's right. He's not into vengeance. That's probably the main thing. Luke.
But he also left out. He also left out the blessing.
And he left out the blessing.
Both out. And I thought it was because it's an orderly account, and he's not dealing with Zion, which I assumed is the heavenly kingdom. So he's left out both vengeance and blessing because he's not ready for that yet.
Yes, and is he blessing the crowd there particularly?
Sorry?
And as this passage goes on, do you think he wants to bless this crowd? What does he do?
The synagogue crowd you're talking about?
I am talking about the synagogue crowd.
No, he's really wanting to shock them with what's happening at the moment.
Exactly. Another reason why Luke would omit the blessing, he is actually provoking them.
He's asking for trouble, yeah.
He is absolutely looking for trouble. How does Luke differ in this account from the Gospel of Mark in terms of why the people get angry at him? What does Mark say? Let's start with that.
Well, they're basically well, not angry. It's who is this? We've grown up with him. What's so special about him?
Exactly. And the Gospel of Mark is mostly, who does he think he is coming here and showing us up, and they get offended at him.
This is the tall poppy syndrome.
Yes.
It is a tall poppy syndrome. And
Jesus makes that famous quote, prophets are not without honour except in their hometown and among their own kin and in their own house. And that is also, and that's something that we know quite well. But is it in the Gospel of Luke?
Well, it is in the sense that but it's not a major point. He does say, is not this Joseph's son, which is a suggestion of, what's special about him, but that's not the real reason he gets...
Back up a bit, because Mark says they took offence at that. Does Luke say that?
No.
No, he doesn't.
Is not this Joseph's son?
There's nothing there to say they were offended by that in the Gospel of Luke.
Right.
Yeah. It's the difference between
that question.
It's the difference between, we know this guy, we've grown up with him. What does he think he's doing? And we know this guy, we've grown up with him. This is amazing what he's saying to us. Like, they're both amazed, but for very different reasons. Yeah.
And that's Luke. Luke is putting the latter, I would put to you, because there's no offence there. But they do get offended. Why do they get offended?
Maybe they're a bit jealous.
Because he's saying that the message is not only for the Jews, but for people outside.
Yes. Well done, Piers. That's exactly why they get offended. If you come down to 25, he says it was the people outside of Israel that listened. It was lepers in Israel. It was the prophet Elijah, unclean people. And that is what fills the synagogue with rage.
Yeah.
So Jesus deliberately provokes them in the Gospel of Luke. And they get really angry when he's basically saying, you don't listen, but these unclean Gentile people do.
So you're not necessarily the chosen ones.
Sorry, what was that?
So you're not necessarily the chosen ones.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he's already made that clear back with John the Baptist, I think.
Yeah.
Another interesting thing, of course, is that prophets are not without honour except in their hometown, amongst their own kin and amongst their own house. That would include James, who eventually became leader of the church. So somewhere between there and Pentecost, James became a believer.
Possibly. Or maybe just Jesus is making a generalist statement that's not meant to be as detailed as taking in every member of the family. But it's possible, Derek, what you're saying. We don't know, but we do know James either was a believer or became a believer. So why do you think Luke has included those quotes from Isaiah and included them the way he did?
He's trying to show that God's plan is inclusive.
Yep, and who's it including?
Gentiles, everyone. But it's including the downtrodden with the widows and the lepers, the people that are on the lowest rung in society.
Yeah. So what does this set the tone for in the Gospel of Luke? Do we find these themes in other places in the Gospel of Luke?
Well, the Samaritan, the parable of the Samaritan would be an example of going outside the Jewish community.
Yes, where the Samaritan is the good guy. Yep. What else?
When he heals the centurion servant.
Yes.
Yep.
Demon-possessed people.
He cures lepers.
Yep.
And he accepts the tears of a woman at a Pharisee's table.
Yep.
Which was pretty alarming.
That's one way of putting it. I like the way
it would have been for was it Simon or something? It
might have been Simon actually.
It would have been rather alarming.
Yeah.
Yeah, he does. A lot of women. He heals a lot of women.
Yes, he does heal a lot of women.
And he has a lot of women followers.
He does have a lot of women followers. So there's a lot of things that are a bit different in the Gospel of Luke, and Luke is really setting the tone for his Gospel in this statement in chapter 4. He's actually giving you Jesus's program.
Another thing that we found was that the Nazareth visit happened before, according to Luke, before the disciples were called as a body.
Yes.
Yes. Well,
so that Peter, John, and James may not have been there.
That's right. They're called in chapter 5, and this takes place in chapter 4.
This might explain why Mark doesn't include it in his story.
Mark has the call of the disciples in chapter 1, and this story happens in chapter 6.
Yeah, yeah. Mm.
So it does say at the beginning there, Derek, he left that place and came to his hometown and his disciples followed him. We don't know if they were in the synagogue at this particular scene, because I don't think Mark tells us, but they're around.
Well, see, a lot of things happened at that time. There's the water and the wine business from John, which is only reported by John.
Yes.
Yes, so I'd treat it with deep suspicion, Derek, but anyway, that's me.
Well, I put Jesus' first voyage to Jerusalem, back through Samaria via the well and the Samaritan woman, and back to Canaan, all in this gap between setting Lazarus and setting out to Jerusalem.
You can do that, Derek, but be aware that the Gospel of Matthew will not accommodate you. Not going to work.
I agree. Matthew's rather too strict.
He's very strict, and Jesus does not go into Samaria and does not wander into Gentile territory in Matthew. So that theory will only take you so far. So just keep that in mind.
We've got to keep in mind that Matthew's very Jewish as well.
He is, but Matthew could be equally telling the truth as the Gospel of John. So you think about that, Derek. It can't both be right. Okay, any other comments that people want to make about Luke?
Do you think it's possible that Luke had read the Gospel of Matthew and wanted to make clear that the Gentiles were included?
I certainly think Luke would have been aware that there were other followers of Jesus that probably would not agree with his more inclusive stance. Whether he has the Gospel of Matthew is another thing, but he would have been aware of communities that differed in opinion from his own. We don't know. I mean,
are you saying then, Elizabeth, that Jesus may have done all of that and said all of that, but they've chosen to just choose parts of what was said?
Yes.
The oral traditions.
Yes, I am saying that the gospel writers pick and choose what they tell stories about because each of them have different intent. Luke's intent is to be inclusive and universalistic and pick up Samaritans and Gentiles and unclean people and the poor and the oppressed. The Gospel of Matthew is on the side of the poor and the oppressed, but you don't get the same women followers there. You don't get the same dynamic as far as Gentiles are concerned. Matthew does not mention Samaritans except to say do not go near them. They don't occur. Matthew's got this rage against Pharisees and he upholds the law. They're very different. They shape their gospels according to what the community they are addressing and the needs of that community are at the time, which makes me say Luke is probably Jewish. He's doing a midrash the same way Matthew is doing, and they're both talking about what is important to their communities and they're shaping the stories around that in good Jewish fashion. And we get hung up about history and facts and truth in the way that first century authors don't care about. They just don't.
So Luke may not be, sorry, so the Spirit of the Lord is upon me quote that Luke includes Jesus may not have actually said that, but Luke's including it to show his interpretation of
possibly
it's Jesus.
It's possible, yes.
Well, I mean, that actually raises an interesting point, and I can refer you to page 96. And page 96 is a discussion about the speeches in Acts, but the same kind of thing could apply to the accounts of what Jesus says in Luke's gospel. Luke wasn't there when that speech was given in the synagogue in Nazareth. Luke wasn't there for a lot of, for what Jesus did. Luke wasn't there probably on the day of Pentecost when Peter gave a long speech. Luke wasn't there when Stephen gives the longest speech in Acts before he's stoned to death. Luke wasn't there. But it could well be that Luke is operating in the way of an educated person of the Hellenistic era, person writing history, Thucydides wrote some centuries before, and he wrote a history of the Peloponnesian War. And he said this about speeches, and a number of scholars believe that this probably applies also to Luke, certainly in terms of the speeches of the apostles, maybe also in terms of how he is shaping the speeches of Jesus. Thucydides said, in this history, I've made use of set speeches, some of which were delivered just before and others during the war. He tells the story of the war, and before every battle, the general of the troops gives a great impressive G up. You know, it's like the football coach in the locker room before they go out onto the field. The general gives this great long speech to encourage them. I have found it difficult to remember the precise words used in the speeches which I listened to myself, and my various informants have experienced the same difficulty. Now, this is the key part. So my method has been, whilst keeping as closely as possible to the general sense of the words that were actually used, to make the speakers say what, in my opinion, was called for by each situation.
Yep.
So I know what Jesus, even though I don't know what Jesus said when he was in the synagogue, I know what Jesus
should have said,
what he
would have
meant.
said, or should have said, or would have said, and I'm going to write that. That may be disturbing to you. And I know what Peter could have said, or should have said, or would have said at the day of Pentecost, so I'm going to write that. So we don't actually necessarily have the verbatim accounts of those speeches, but perhaps Luke is operating in this model, which was the standard model used by historians and writers for centuries before.
And it was taught in schools. You were taught to put speeches together in schools, and they've got a certain form, you know, where you have a prologue and you have certain rhetorical devices that you use within them. And you were taught and you practice writing them about what you would put in such speeches. So what you have in Acts and what you have in the Gospels could be what the writers thought Jesus should have said at that time. And that may be partly an oral source they're using, but they've shaped it in a way that suits their particular outlook.
Yeah. Stephen's defence obviously formed the basis of a lot of, a lot of Paul's later speeching.
Well, it's interesting looking at the content of, I've done studies of the speeches in Acts, Derek, and it's looking at the content of what Peter and Stephen and Paul say. And if you put all of that together, you get a very clear history of Israel, but each of them only takes a little bit, which also might say something about the intentionality of the author. I'm not going to give you everything all in one go, but as you read through this work, you will hear the whole story of Israel told through the mouths of the apostles.
But it's noticeable that when Paul is not speaking to Jews in Athens, he uses a philosophical approach.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yes, that's correct. And that's why I say Luke is a Hellenized, urbane Jew. And
so I think there's a lot, there's a lot of pointers to Luke's education. Look,
Elizabeth, can I just ask you a question? You've said that the author of Luke was a Jew. A number of texts that I read put him down as a Gentile.
Yes.
Yep, they do. But I'm arguing ferociously with that simply because his knowledge of scripture is so good and his knowledge of Jewish tradition is so good. That's why I believe he's a Hellenized Jew, and there were plenty of them.
Right.
So Norman, what you're reading is the majority view amongst scholars, but there is a minority view that the majority view is saying Luke was a Gentile because Luke writes the gospel for the Gentiles. But there is a minority view which Elizabeth adheres to and which I've come to adhere to in my workings on Luke, that thinks he actually was a Jew who was very much at home in Hebrew scriptures, but also very aware of and immersed in the Hellenistic world, the conventions of rhetoric that Elizabeth was talking about, and knew the history, the way that history was written. So we think of Luke as a historian, and he was a historian, but not in the way that we write history. He was a historian of the time.
And if he really was picked up in Troy, he was a well-travelled, so he was, he was far more aware of what was going on in the world than, say, Matthew would have been.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Derek. I think he is an urbane Jew and he is
Yes,
well travelled.
absolutely.
But we better give the last couple of minutes to John, who needs
Look,
to add some things.
What I'm going to do is just play the start of a video about Acts, and then I'll send you out an email, and you can look at the Bible Project. We use their videos from time to time. They have some fabulous little videos. But just to give you a sense of what's going on in Acts, let's look at this video.
The first video we watched Luke open the book by showing us how the risen Jesus was exalted as the King of the world. He promised to send the Holy Spirit as his own personal presence to empower his followers to go out into the world and bear witness to the good news about his kingdom until he would return one day. And so the movement began in Jerusalem as the Spirit came and formed Jesus' followers into the new temple promised by the scriptural prophets. But this generated conflict with the leaders of Jerusalem, and so it led to the persecution of the Christians. But the Spirit transformed it into good. It actually became the means by which the originally Jewish Jesus communities were pushed outside Jerusalem to become a multi-ethnic international movement. And the flagship church of this diverse Jesus movement was in Antioch, the largest city in that part of the Roman Empire. So we left the story with Barnabas and Paul serving in the Antioch church, and the Spirit prompts the church to send them on a missionary journey, which opens up a whole new section of the book. The story is about Paul and his co-workers traveling to different cities around the Roman Empire, announcing the good news that Jesus is king.
Well, we shall leave that there. Yeah, so that's and then what Acts goes on is Paul and his various journeys, and then eventually he's arrested, accused of turning things completely upside down, and is sent because he says he's a Roman citizen. He is sent to be tried before the emperor, and the book of Acts ends with him in Rome under house arrest. We don't know what happens according to Luke. Luke doesn't tell us what happens to Paul. There's later traditions about what happened to Paul in Rome. So that's Acts in 2.5 minutes.
John, if you send out both links for the Bible Project for Acts, you can. I think one's about 12 minutes and one's about 8 minutes. If you can spare the time, that will take you through the structure and the content and the various themes of Acts. So John can put that in an email to you. The last thing I'll say about Acts, of course, is Acts has female disciples, female teachers, and female leaders of house churches in it. And I just want to remind people of that. Not all the disciples were male. It's really important to note that in the story of the book of Acts, that we actually have not only these salubrious men who went and did various wondrous things, we also have a whole lot of women who were doing different things. There we are. Are there other disciples? And we have Tabitha, who Peter raises from the dead. We have Lydia, who is the merchant that runs her own household, and she's running a God-fearing little Jewish kind of thing that Paul visits, and she in effect becomes the first church where they are. And then we have Priscilla, who is mentioned quite a number of times in the New Testament with her husband Aquila in Acts and indeed in Romans as well, who established no less than 3 house churches, Paul tells us and Luke tells us. So I just want you to remember that the women are really important, and we're often not being taught about them in our churches and in our Sunday schools and in our other traditions. And so you might like to look them up at your leisure. Perhaps John could send out those references to those passages as well, and we'll give you a bit of information about them too.
One of the women that I read somewhere, Joanna, who follows Jesus, is the Hebrew name, and Junia, who Paul says was a Christian before me, is the Roman version of that. So I'd say it suggested that Joanna becomes a missionary.
Well, we don't know, Derek. I have to say, because they're in different books. One's in Romans and one's in the Gospel of Luke. So we don't know. It's like, John is a common name. Simon is a common name. We've got Simon Peter, Simon the Zealot, and Simon the Pharisee.
Yes,
we
but I'm
can't
talking
make
about,
the
I'm
assumption.
talking about Joanna and Junior.
Well, you can't make that assumption. It's possible, but we don't know.
Well, Paul says she was in Christ before he was. So
Well, that's true, but she might have been converted by Priscilla and Aquila at Ephesus.
yeah, she might have been.
Or at Corinth. We don't know. So the tradition weaves things together because it likes clumping things together, but we can't know that that's a fact. That's all I'm pointing out. But we do know Junia was an apostle, and that shall not be taken from her.
All right. Next week, we're going to the fourth of the Gospels. And so once again, if you can read a few pages, it's pages 98, 99, and the first part of page 100. And a lot of what we'll be doing next week is looking at the various differences that are noted there and looking at some passages. So picking up the distinctive nature of the fourth Gospel. So that's for next week. So it's been good to have you all participating today, and happy reading for next week.